Welcome, everyone. So glad that you are with us. I have the tremendous pleasure and honor of welcoming Dr. Talli Rosenbaum. Talli is somebody that I have really kind of admired from afar for a very long time. And then we ended up in a group space together online and in a listserv. And all of a sudden we're corresponding with the best. And it was so exciting. So welcome, Talli Rosenbaum.
Thank you. That's very kind.
So
Thank
glad
you.
that you're here. I wanted to first, I'd love for you to introduce yourself to our audience because you have a really unique kind of professional trajectory of where you started and where you are today. Tell us a little about yourself.
Let's see. Well, I started with a real interest in women's health as a pelvic floor physical therapist. That was my first profession. And as such, I treated women in all stages of life with issues that have to do with being a woman, with childbearing. So whether it's prenatal, postpartum back pain or pelvic floor issues. And then slowly, as things emerged, this was very natural. I went into treating women who would come with problems having to do with their sex life. And they would ask me all kinds of questions, and I wasn't trained to answer questions about sex. So I went on to study sex counseling, and I became a certified sex counselor through an organization, ASECT. And at the time, I was still studying. I was still a physical therapist, but I had begun to study, to go to graduate school and study therapy. And that really informed my journey. A lot of what I saw and experienced and what I witnessed with women around having pain with intercourse really is what pushed me to leave the field of physical therapy in order to become a individual and couples therapist.
Do you consider yourself formally a sex therapist at this point? Because you have the training
I'm a certified sex therapist. I'm
as
a
well, right?
sex therapy supervisor. Um, but I don't work as behaviorally as most sex therapists. I think people have a funny idea of what sex therapists do. They think that sex therapists, teach people positions and how to have sex. Um, and I don't really do that much of that. There are plenty of people out there doing that, but I'm a therapist. I deal with
Right.
actual therapy issues, which is again why I went into it, is because in treating sexual issues, there are so many things that come up, past trauma and couples dynamics. And it's it's not just about functionally being able to do something.
Right.
It's something that carries a lot of meaning, and it impacts yourself, it impacts your relationships, it impacts, how you interact with sex, and how sex lands for you has a lot to do with so many factors that are not just biological, and they're not just physical, they're also spiritual, they're your values, they're also how you feel in your relationship, and how you are as a person, as a person who is or isn't entitled to pleasure, is or isn't comfortable in her body and in her skin, is or isn't able to be vulnerable or relaxed. So it's so much not about, finding the right lubricant or that kind of thing, the technical stuff, even though that stuff is important too. But it was so much more, there was so much underneath the
Yeah.
question came in for me that I
Yeah.
really needed to have more understanding of what 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 it is for people to engage in sexual relationships.
Yeah. I so appreciate this comment and this opening is because I will tell you a funny story. I recently I was talking with my father, who's a listener of our podcast, which just makes me very proud. And I once said to him, like, he has such a hard time with the word sex therapist, like that his nice, good Jewish daughter is becoming a sex therapist. And I said to him, what do you think I do? And he's like, I don't know. And I said, we're going to have a conversation because I do think there's some misunderstanding and in many ways, I think this was part of my understanding and training. And what I learned in the training that I've completed as well is it really is almost all about relationships than it more so than the dynamic component of it. And it's much more about like the couple and the experience physically and the history and the trauma. And it's so much more than behavioral. So I'm so glad that, my father and I had a good laugh on it, because it was something that he, I think, still struggles with a little bit. And this, but really what it is talking about relationships. And I think that that's a great way to begin this
Including
conversation.
your relationship with yourself.
For sure, for
Yeah.
sure. So I want to start with there's many topics that I've heard you speak about. I do want you to give a plug for your podcast called Intimate Judaism. It's a phenomenal podcast with Rabbi Kahn. So many different aspects of the experience of physical health and emotional health and religious world that we live in. So please make sure that you check out that podcast, and I'll try to make sure to tag it as well in the episode. But I want to take one angle with you, because I feel like this is something that keeps coming up in conversations about launching into a sexual relationship of a newly married couple. And that's the angle that we're going to focus on. We're talking about a heterosexual, probably religious couple. Let's go with that. In terms of, with the assumptions that I'd like to introduce as follows, the assumptions are that they don't have previous sexual experience and they have some limited knowledge about their body, but that has a lot of variety depending on where this couple is coming from. And the intention is one that they will build a healthy sexual relationship together. So we know that in many different cultures within our own, communities of culture, there can be people who will have met one time, two times before they get married. And then let's go with them a little bit more normative of people who have dated and gone out for several months or several weeks. And they are connecting emotionally, maybe not so much physically. And now they're entering into this new relationship that we're calling marriage. And part of that marriage will be that is the onset of the sexual relationship. So I would love for us to break that down a little bit about if you could design the perfect onboarding into marriage for a sexual life, where do we begin, and where would you love to maybe change what's out there, or let's just stick it in the optimistic of like, this is the ideal. What would it look like? Where would we start?
Well, look, I think that ideally we are sexual human beings from the time we're born, even in utero. In other words, being a human means being sexual, because sexuality is about the self. It's about pleasure. It's about sensory experiences. It's about our relationship with our bodies. There's really a lot to sexuality that really begins with the relationship to self and other. In other words, as when we're children, right? We get, if we're developing in a healthy way, right? We're going to get a lot of feedback from our parents, who will feed back to us what what are the healthy boundaries. So for example, if we, if you picture like this, I've got grandkids, right? So, if you picture like a 2 or 3 year old who wants a cookie really bad, I want, right? And so, that's kind of like the learning of assertiveness. Now, a child who is allowed to be assertive, child who is allowed to say what they want, they don't always get what they want. Yes, I know you want this, but you can't have the cookie until after dinner, that kind of thing. But then there's, the child whose assertiveness is cut down from a very young age. And so in a environment where a child doesn't really have a sense of autonomy or isn't allowed to be assertive, that, for example, they might become a pleaser, a people pleaser, in order to survive their environment. They might not be developmentally haven't been given the tools to create boundaries or to be able to say no, right? So that makes them vulnerable. On the flip side, if you are a child and you're brought up with appreciation for your body, with the body parts named, without shame, your questions are answered. You're taught that, if you touch yourself, that's fine. It's nice. It feels good, but you should do it in a private place. And it's not about just sexual stuff. It can be like, doesn't that flower smell great? Doesn't um, any kind of development of of any kind of sensual pleasure is something that's going to end up being positive for sexuality. And then comes this idea of intimacy. From the time we're little, we begin to develop friendships. And as we get into the middle school years and to the teen years, we rely very heavily on the friendships that we make. And the way we feel in those friendships are going to determine our ability to trust.
Hmm.
This is what we call attachment. We when we have a secure attachment, we trust people and we believe that people are not out to get us and that, most people are safe, and we feel safe with who we end up choosing to marry, and we feel safe and vulnerable enough to engage in a journey. Now, the sexual experiencing is always going to be a journey. So ideally, and we're going to take into consideration that, in Orthodox Jewish life, there are some very strict rules about premarital sexual experimentation. But if we are establishing a relationship, then ideally we feel an attraction towards the partner that we're going to marry. We're able to talk about the attraction, and then we're able to prepare for how we want to begin to experience touch with one another. It's talked about, and it's experienced with a lot of like, are you okay? Is this okay? Consent and asking about how it's going. Um, and time,
Yeah.
understanding that, that the sex is about so many things, including intimacy and connection and pleasure and comfort. It's not just about succeeding in intercourse, which unfortunately has become the,
Yeah.
the the goal. The goal is if we
Right.
succeeded on our wedding night. Well, how do you measure success? You know, do you measure success with, we managed to do intercourse if it was painful or traumatic? I mean, that doesn't sound successful to me.
Right.
And there's a lot in
Right.
some I would say communities, there's a lot of emphasis on doing the deed without any of the stuff surrounding it that has to do with compassion and caring and intimacy and empathy and communication.
Right. Okay, I want to back this up because I feel like you've put so much already onto the table. So I want to back it up to the discussion about our relationships and our friendships as children being one of, creating secure attachment, and that you use the word vulnerability once, but I want to explore that concept of vulnerability a little bit more because to me it feels like vulnerability is such a key component of creating a healthy sexual experience with a partner, right? So when you see attachment, healthy attachment in a relationship, tell me a little bit more about what you understand to be like the value of vulnerability, and where does that come in to a partnered relationship
So,
eventually?
okay, so in many ways. So first of all, it's vulnerable to speak your feelings. And many young adults will come into, will emerge into young adulthood and adulthood without much of an experience of um, being able to identify, let alone communicate what they're feeling. And a lot of it is because they've shut their feelings down. And they've shut their feelings down because their feelings would have been too overwhelming to contain, that their feelings were not validated, they were not mirrored. And so they kind of went through life in a shutdown state, not really talking about their feelings. And then they get to an intimate relationship and they're not able to really be emotionally vulnerable. And emotional vulnerability, talking about your feelings, it's what helps create intimacy, and it creates empathy and connection in your partner when you can be vulnerable and talk about your feelings. That's one component of it. Another component of it is that the actual physiological experience of enjoying sex requires the ability to let go,
Mm,
the ability to feel that you're safe, that nothing bad is going to happen to you, and that, your partner is with you in a way that feels secure. Your boundaries will be respected. They'll stop if you ask them. If something doesn't feel comfortable, you can say, and that they want your pleasure. They want you to have a good time. And you want them to feel this, you also want them to have a good time. Like you're doing this in good faith. You're doing this with, you know, recognizing that it's new and it might take some trial and error, and a sense of humor is helpful. But, you know, there isn't this component of fear. Fear and sex do not go together well. It's
Right.
not a place to be afraid of failing, to be afraid of not getting the mitzvah done, to be afraid that, you know, you're not going to be good at it or good enough as a wife. And afraid for the male too, because I don't know if you have men listening, but it's not a picnic either for men. Everyone thinks, oh, you know, he's waiting, he's been waiting. And, you know, you have to, yeah, all this kind of stuff as if, but the men are anxious as well. It's new
Sure.
for them too. And the ability to kind of relieve one another's anxiety by talking about how awkward it might be. And it might not be awkward, it might be completely natural, but it's completely natural when you both want it and you both can be present in it.
Hmm. Hmm. I think about also that word, that idea of like to be vulnerable, to say, I think just, I'm just moving back for one more second, just to that idea of like in childhood where somebody says, or even in young adulthood, where like, you know, get over it or stop crying or, you know, you can deal with this. You don't have to be so overly emotional about it. That's the same. I want to be clear that those kinds of messages from family, community, parents also is inhibitory in terms of that ability to say, well, I guess, you know, it's we're not talking abusive, but we're expressing where even just learning, even just hearing from someone, it's okay that you're sad, and then let's also figure out how to manage these feelings is valuable and much more beneficial than you stop being so over dramatic or stop, right? I just want to be clear, we're not talking about abusive. We're talking about scenarios that, and very often I think is just how parents were raised, right? How your parent was raised and how her parent was raised, and like it's not intentionally abusive. It's just these subtle things that can happen in teenage years, perhaps even as they become a little more complicated, right? That begins to say, I don't, when I express a thought and I express an emotion and I express a feeling, it's not necessarily, I have to just deal with it myself, right? I don't necessarily, and I don't love the word validation, even though I just feel it's like overused, but you know, that where it's invalidated. And so what does that look like when you come into a sexual experience and you say, I don't know that I'm comfortable with this? Well, if your voice in your head is like, just deal with it, just get over it, just manage it, you're an adult, you can handle it. That's the voice that's going to be loudest in those moments. I'm wondering, let's move over to that idea of this should be pleasurable, because I feel like pleasure was never something that I heard discussed in any of my Kala classes and any of my preparation for marriage courses. Like I don't remember ever hearing anybody say to me, this should be enjoyable and pleasurable. I definitely was told at some point this should not be painful, but I was never, I don't remember, and it was, thank God, many years ago, but I don't remember the education of pleasure being included in Kala courses. And I know that much has changed in, thank God, 27 years, but I do think there's still a significant deficit. What's your experience been in this?
Yeah, I agree. I do think that that things are changing. And I think that whether or not there's discussion of pleasure really has to do with not necessarily even the culture, but who's teaching you and how important it is, or whether they know about it, or whether many teachers may just assume that it will be pleasurable,
Right.
even talk about pleasure. You know, one of the things that I said before about when I was a physical therapist, I would have women who would say to me, you know, and this is really what was so heartbreaking for me, was that women would come to me and say, listen, I have to be able to have sex with my husband. And I don't care. Don't talk to me about pleasure. I need it to not hurt. That's my only goal right now, is that it not hurt. I have to be able to do it. And they
Mm.
would be dissociative during the sessions. And what one of the things that I used to do when I still do it, I teach to college teachers in courses. I'm asked to come lecture, and I'll talk about the wedding night, and I'll talk about how there really isn't such a thing as the first time, in a sense that it's an ongoing and until you're ready. And you know, in like you asked me about what's ideal, it's ideal to not have to go from not ever having touched anybody to intercourse right away. Like that really is difficult. And if couples can be told that, take some time, start with, I like to say, don't be shomer anymore, break shomer.
Break shower.
Because when you break
Right.
shomer, you're not having sex, you're just,
Right.
starting
Right.
with, okay.
Let
So
me just explain. Breaking shomer means to be shomer negia is a Hebrew term for not touching the opposite sex in within and there are a few relationships that we're allowed to touch each other, parent to child, spouses, things like that. But boyfriend and girlfriend is where they're mostly trying to be shomer negia, and then to break it means that oh whoops, we started touching or holding hands or whatever that looks like for that person. So breaking shomer. Go ahead.
and I'll come to some interesting things about that as well. But when that happens, there's usually an experience of building excitement, where things kind of go further each time a little bit more. And going from zero to everything in like 10 minutes or whatever it is, can potentially be extremely traumatic. You're not ready for it.
Yeah.
One of the things I would tell the college teachers is, what are you telling these women? What are you telling these young women who are about to get married? And they tell me what they should lay down, put a towel and use a lubricant and open, like just very technical. And I said, well, how do you know when they're ready? And they're like, well, when the husband's ready, they're ready, right? And I said, how do you know the husband's ready? Okay, so they knew how to say how you know if the husband's ready. They know that there's an erection and there's blood flow to the penis, and you can tell that he's ready. I'm like, well, how do you know that the woman's ready?
Hmm.
Right? And I said, you wouldn't tell a man who does not have an erection to
Just do
penetrate.
it. Right.
Okay. You wouldn't just
Right.
say just do it. So if a woman is not, showing any signs of arousal, if she's not lubricating, if she's not relaxed, if she's not ready, then why would you tell her that she's ready when she's physiologically not? We want to get to there little by little. Now, the other thing I wanted to say about Shomer Nagia is that a lot of couples who were not Shomer Nagia, but clearly did not have intercourse, very often have said to me that before marriage, touching was exciting for them. They had a very high desire, and then right after marriage, when touching became about having intercourse, and intercourse was painful for them, or just not comfortable, or they didn't figure out how it
Mm.
works or whatever, they lost all their desire. So
Wow.
sometimes so I'll say, wow, it sounds like intercourse ruined sex for you. Um,
Wow. Wow.
yeah, there's a lot of
Wow.
focus on,
Right.
doing the deed when in fact there's so much more to touch and to arousal and to getting to know your partner's bodies and exploring and taking your time. And when I first began to talk to these college teachers, they would be really very anxious by my lack of anxiety. Um, I would be met with, well, what's going to happen to the guy? What's going to happen? And I'm like, well, what are you afraid of? I
Oh
mean, we all
God, don't get me started. This
we
is
all
one of
know
those real trigger points, I think, because I
a
think what
lot of
we
us.
do is we really have disempowered and I think devalued our men to think that they are animalistic in their approach to sexuality and sexual experiencing. I wish we honored our men so much more and held them to the level that I think they can be held, which is it'll be in the right time in the right place when she's ready together. You're working towards that versus this like, oh my gosh, he's gonna. The line is always he's gonna go to a prostitute. Like if they don't have sex, he's gonna get divorced. Like no, like can we please give them a little bit more respect? Okay, that's my
Yeah,
platform
but
for the
I
day.
don't even think we need to catastrophize about going to a prostitute or getting divorced. I think that there are some real concerns about ejaculating outside of the vagina, that
Yeah,
that's a really horrible thing, when in
right.
fact, there's a lot of halachic lenience for that to happen when a couple is on their way to learning. And the most difficult thing and the most heartbreaking thing are the stories of women who really believe that they need to allow intercourse despite trauma and dissociation and pain because they're afraid of their
That he will
husbands
sin. That he
ejaculating
right.
outside of the vagina when, that the thinking that that's better is really crazy when you
I
think
know.
about it.
I know.
And it shouldn't be that way. And many women will come after, sometimes even after years, saying, I feel like an object. I feel like, I need to be the place for him to finish, but
Right.
um,
Right.
that's
I
just,
had a conversation with a woman once who was coming home from mikvah, and she was post loss, and she was incredibly distressed. She called me literally from the streets, she would say, I'm on the streets of Bar Park, and I cannot go home. And I said to her, like, and she said to me, like, how can I go home and tell him I'm not ready to be intimate? And I said to her, let me offer you a question. If you said to your husband, would you rather I'm honest and open with you and saying I'm not physically ready to be intimate yet because we just had another pregnancy loss? Or would we rather just do it because, it's a mitzvah and because you haven't been with me in 6 to 8 weeks and it's so difficult for you? What do you think he would prefer? She, without hesitation said to me, oh no, for sure, number one. For sure he would prefer me being in my body, being feeling good, feeling pleasant, feeling pleasure. I said, so could we trust him enough in the relationship to have this conversation? And I feel like sometimes that's where the disconnect is. It's this idea of like, I know that this is what he needs, and I want to be a good woman, wife, and person, and
yeah.
give it to him.
And it's really unfortunate for the man because that's not what he wants.
Exactly.
And I've had so many men who sit there in the office and they're like, I don't want that. I
Yeah.
don't want that. And they are often traumatized as well because
Yes.
their wives will not tell them that it hurts or pretend that it's fine. And they lose trust in their wives. They say,
Yeah.
no, forget it. We're not doing it again. We're not.
Right.
And it's really sad because there isn't necessarily an education towards communication. There's just this feeding of ideas that this is what men need and this is what women have to provide. I really, really hope that this is changing.
Yeah. I'm curious when you say, when in your experience, and I know you have vast experience, what are you hearing? Give me the words. What are the men saying? I would rather if, like fill in the blank. What are they saying? This is in an ideal, healthy relationship. The men are saying what?
I don't want sex that you don't want to have.
Mm,
Um, they feel like terrible. There's a tremendous amount of guilt. There's a tremendous amount of shame. And they would prefer not to have sex at all than to have sex that they know their wife does not want.
yeah.
And that hurts them. Men want, and it's not even about the sex. I mean, it's also about the sex, but
Right.
men really just want the same things. Men are people, women are people, and we all want the same thing. They want to be seen, they want to be wanted, and they want to be loved. And
Connection, to
they're,
feel
yeah,
connected to that
and they
person.
want
Yeah.
a connection. And, the problem is that when you as a woman feel bad or guilty for not being available to give it, to
Right.
engage in it, um, very often you're going to be too wrapped up in your own guilt to be able to just give basic compassion and empathy. I love you. I really know you wanted to have sex tonight, and I really would have loved to, and I know it's hard for you, and I love you. And, like without guilt, without defensiveness, um, but knowing that, you're entitled. Uh, I had a woman who every Friday night was like so anxiety provoking for her. She would go to sleep and be, okay, is this a night that I can put my head on the pillow and go to sleep? Or is this going to be I mean, not every Friday. It was like for the 2 weeks that she was not Nita. Every night was like, is this going to be a night that I have to do it? Or is this going to be a night that I can just go to sleep?
Yeah.
I mean, horrible
I want
experience,
It
ongoing.
is. Yeah, it really is. And I think also it's interesting because you say, can I give it to him? Right.
Right, right.
Can I give
That's
it?
how it's framed.
It's framed as giving. And I'm wondering about that. And I want to make sure because I really want to make sure we discuss a little bit about consent because I think that that's also a
It's
topic that
all
was
about consent. This is all about consent. This whole discussion,
exactly,
yeah,
exactly. So
about autonomy.
consent about even just the concept of a consent though I think also that was never discussed. The idea of like that you have the permission to say, I can't do this, or I don't want to do this, or I'm unavailable to do this. And I think where there's that struggle is like, I want to give him this. That is so, like, you should want to give it to your husband because he needs it or because he wants it or because, again, in some circles, because we don't want him turning elsewhere. You shouldn't deny this of him, or we don't want him to have to sin by having an ejaculation outside of you, right? Like that kind of idea. When we bring the language of the concept of consent, and like you just said, which is everything we've just been talking about, bring it. I love the way that you have talked about different kinds of consent. Can you lay it out there for me for a minute?
Yeah, we actually, I will plug the podcast because we have an episode. I don't remember what number it's called. Uh, I want, I will, I want something like that. I don't remember, but we talked about our different levels of consent. So, at the first level of consent, it's like I'm really into it. I'm as excited as you are. I really want to do this and I'm enthusiastic. Okay. But then, we don't always have complete enthusiasm. And sometimes we are tired and sometimes we're not completely in the mood. And there is this kind of cognitive understanding or motivation that, but it's good for us. And it's good, it's good not micromanaging my husband's mood, but rather it's good for us. It's been a while and we really should connect even though I'm tired. Now, that works when there is a knowledge that your body's going to respond once you get started. And that's called responsive desire. And many, many women who may not have a lot of spontaneous desire, especially after birth or several kids or just over time, women tend to be caretakers and they don't even like always remember to go to the bathroom or take a drink of water, so they're not going to be like, oh my God, I have to have sex, I have to have sex so they don't think about it so much.
Right.
And so what happens is that once they're doing it, very often, like, oh my gosh, this is great, this is really nice, and there's everything kicks in, the arousal, the orgasm, everything is nice, and it's a wonderful experience. So women like that who will say, I don't really have a lot of, like, I can go for a while and not think about it, but once, you know, we do it, I have a wonderful time and it's great. And I'm so glad we did. And that's perfectly normal functionally. And that's certainly legitimate to say, I want it. I don't really feel like it, but I'm not in the I can get in the mood. Like, get me in the mood. It's fine. And
Right.
that's definitely a very acceptable level of consent.
Sure.
Um,
I'd have to
now,
say that especially when we're dealing with long-term monogamous relationships,
absolutely.
right?
Yeah.
That as I know, like Brené Brown talks I'm sorry, no, Esther Perel, not Brené Brown, my other favorite person, where Esther Perel talks about this idea of the erotic self is that, I don't think we have that erotic experience of like, oh my gosh, I see my spouse and the fireworks happen after many, many years of marriage. Unless, for some women, they'll say, yeah, but if he does the dishes, I will absolutely see the fireworks going, right? That idea of like erotic self may look very different after a long-term monogamous relationship. So I just want to like plug that reality, especially when dealing with the religious
Right.
community,
But the sex itself can get
can
better
be
and
great.
better.
Exactly.
You know
Absolutely.
each other's bodies very, very well. You're very comfortable with each other. You can have a sense of humor and it's like really relaxed. And when it's
Right.
relaxed, it gets better. It gets better over time. So people that say, oh, it's not like how it was in the beginning, like, oh, who would want how it was in the
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. Right.
beginning? Okay. So, uh, so other levels of consent have more to do with I'm I I don't really want, but um, I could change my mind. I'm open to it. And I think it's probably better if I do, right? And then we're getting more into the last level, which is really not consent at all, which is I better, because if I don't, I'm a little bit worried about the consequences of saying no. Okay. And that's really not consent. It's kind of like, all right, because I can't really say no.
Yeah.
And I think that the awareness of where am I now? And people will ask, and so I had a question the other day where somebody said, well, what if um, I don't really want to, but I say okay because responsive desire and all, and I do have an orgasm, but I find that afterwards I'm really resentful. Like I didn't really want to do it, even if everything worked.
Interesting.
Yeah, because you've got reflexes, so everything can
Right.
work, but it's not really how you wanted to spend your time. You actually don't come out of it feeling emotionally satisfied.
Yeah.
Maybe you had an orgasm, but so what? It wasn't an emotionally satisfying experience because you felt coerced. You felt you had to.
Mm,
Then you end up resentful. And so what I say is you have to really have a lot of awareness going in. Am I going to come out of this feeling happy that I did it? Or am I feeling a little bit coerced? Am I doing this because I feel like I'm going to pay in some way if I don't?
hmm.
And,
Yeah.
and
Just to say one thing on that comment, because I think that immediately makes my mind go to what's going on in the relationship, right?
absolutely.
Beyond the sexual responsiveness is if someone ends up feeling resentful, then I have to believe that there was some other component in the relationship that's absent and missing that this is not going to replace. Like having sex, having a physiologic response is not going to make me feel more loved, more connected, more appreciated by my spouse. Or it's also not going to make me feel more connected to my spouse if there has been a dip in our emotional connection, right? That concept of like emotional intimacy being so critical in our marriages.
The worst case scenario is that you've got like a mean or narcissistic husband, God forbid.
Sure.
Really is a danger. You are going to pay, and that really is horrible. And hopefully that's not your situation. But most of the time, I'll have a couple in my office, and he'll be like, "Why? What? Like, what are you talking about? You never have to say yes. I'll be fine." And a
Right.
lot of it is in her own head, also fed by societal and cultural messages that have
Sure.
told that she has to, but it's not him.
Right, right. Absolutely. Absolutely. I once heard from somebody this idea of like sometimes you have sex, sometimes you just because it's a gift. I'm wondering how you like or don't like that language. Sometimes you just do it because it's a gift and it feels good to be a giver and it feels good to be gifting this to your spouse sometimes, which I think aligns in many ways with, the
I
second
think it really
category.
depends. It really depends.
Right.
If you're somebody you know, um, who's ambivalently attached, has had sexual trauma, has, had reenactments of that trauma, and comes from a place of I want to give you this, but it's not from a healthy place, then
Then
you
it's
got to.
risky. Hmm.
But if you're somebody with a really healthy sense of self, a healthy sense of agency, a healthy sense of autonomy, there's something healthy to that, as opposed to somebody who's going to say, I will never ever consent unless that, that, that. Like there is something
Exactly.
about it as long as it's coming from a healthy place. And obviously you're not going to like lay there like a robot. You're going to enjoy it. Like if you're
Right,
going
right,
to do it, you're going to be
right,
into it.
right,
Then
right.
or sometimes doing another act, which
Hmm.
is, may not be intercourse, but maybe to 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 kind of give something to your husband when you're not so into it.
Right.
Because for whatever reason, and maybe you have an issue and you can't, or you don't want to, or you're tired, but you do that if that's something that's in your
In your
in
repertoire.
your
Right.
repertoire.
Yeah.
Um, I think
Yeah.
it says something about how, the often cry, which is like, you can do that once in a while, but you shouldn't do
Right.
that all the time.
Right.
So
Right.
let's say you do that just to be nice, you like to give. By the way, a lot of women will say that they'll do that and then talk a day, like in the middle of it, they'll get turned on by it, and then they'll.
Right. Right. I think that's an important piece that I just have to state here that also like part of this idea of consenting might be saying, I'm comfortable with us having intercourse. I don't need to have an orgasm. I don't need to experience that like intensity of pleasure right now. I'm just comfortable. I'm comfortable in our relationship. That'll be next time or the time before, but I'm okay if it's something a little bit shorter, faster, as long as there's no pain, as long as it's consensual, as long as it feels mutually enjoyable. Like it shouldn't be uncomfortable at that point. But it doesn't always have like you talk about like that whole it doesn't have to be a 5 course meal, right? Sometimes sex is different depending on what's going on in each other's lives.
But it's really only going to be sustainable if she enjoys it too.
100%. Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. For sure. As we begin to wrap up, I'm thinking one thing we did not discuss, but I just want to put it out there. We didn't discuss about the idea of like the critical importance of developing our own identity before we move into the marriage space, like that idea of like, what is enjoyable for me? What is pleasurable? And I'm not even talking about self-pleasure per se, but you were saying to, if somebody says to you, does this feel good or does this feel good? I'm wondering like if there's something that you would, in an ideal world, what would you recommend in pre-marriage or as you begin your relationship to begin to understand what is the development of self so that you're bringing a fuller bodied embodied self to the relationship?
Well, a lot of it is a problem because if you're 18 or 19, you haven't even gotten there yet. In some aspects you may have, um, but in other aspects, I think that really having a fully embodied sense of self, and again, it's gonna develop over time. None of us have. I mean, I was married at 21. I can't say that I had a fully developed sense of self. I think we grow
Sure.
together. Um, but I think being able to know yourself enough to know what you like, to be able to um, communicate what you like and what you don't like, not to be afraid, to be assertive, not to be reactive to things, rather than, but to kind of say calmly, to be able to say calmly what is good for you, what isn't good for you, to know what your values are, your beliefs, to be able to articulate them,
Hmm.
um, to kind of be able to differentiate yourself from your partner, not take things personally, not think of your partner as my husband and everything he says or does has to do with me.
Mm.
Be able to see
Hmm.
yourselves as two separate people, two adults that may have different opinions, that may have conflict, knowing how to resolve conflict. I mean, these are all really important skills.
Right.
Um, and
Mm,
it's all part
mm.
of the development of self and development of relationship with other.
Right. And very often not something that is fully developed as an 18, 19, or 20-year-old. Like that really can take part of that emerging adulthood time that for some couples is going to happen in a marriage versus before a marriage, just based on our culture.
Right.
Yeah.
And hopefully it happens in a way that is mutually respectful, mutually compassionate, mutually empathic, mutually um, loving and respectful. I mean,
Right.
it
Right.
doesn't always happen that way because a lot of couples really don't know each other. And if we go to the Hasidic world where they've only met for an hour, you need a lot of siyata dishmaya. You need a lot of help from God because
Yeah.
you know, it can be great, but it can also be a freaking disaster.
Yes. Then they're in our offices. Exactly. Exactly. Let's end off with what are some misconceptions that you would love to deep like kind of let people understand.
Well, let's see. Misconceptions having to do with like the wedding night or that kind of
Sure.
thing.
Sure. Or just about building a relationship.
Oh, about building a relationship. Well, I think one misconception is, you don't have to have anything till you get married because after marriage you can build everything. And I think that after marriage there's a lot you're going to build, but there does need to be some intimacy before you need to have seen the person not only in their best selves that they presented themselves. You need to know how they deal with stress, how they deal with difficult situations, what they look like in a conflict. These are really important. So just to say that, just get married and then you'll figure it all out, that's just really playing Russian roulette in many ways.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
now, this thing about sex is being something that you have to succeed at, something that you have to do. A lot of the hadracha, a lot of the guidance is often very technical. Um, it's if that, I would say that like in that very Haredi, very Hasidish world, there's a lot more technical guidance than there would be. Let's say like my college teacher barely spoke about sex at all. I think she just
Same.
assumed that we would
We
all
would know. Hmm.
know those mechanics of it because we would have learned it somewhere. But for like Hasidic couples, they're very specific, and this is what you do, and you lay like this, and then you touch your face 3 times. I mean, but it's very very like you're reading the Shulchan Aruch, like so any other ritualized activity, right? So
Hmm.
um, and this idea that there is definitely I'm going to differentiate between the halachic concept, which there is a halachic concept of bi'ah rishona, which is the first time that you penetrate. But I'm going to put that aside and for a moment, because that's more of a halachic concept, and say that there really isn't one first time, that it's very, very normal for penetration, for full penetration to happen only after several trials, not trials, several attempts or several experiences, I would rather
Sure.
say. It's really like anything else. Things develop, things take time. You're pregnant for 9 months. You don't just get pregnant and have a baby the next day. Your body has to adjust. So becoming sexually active is also a journey. Getting used to having your body touched, getting used to the feeling of arousal. And your vagina, by the way, isn't like I think there's a lot of myths around the hymen and,
Right.
the pushing through it and the bleeding. No, it's not something that covers your vagina. It's like a fibrous ring around the entry. Some women have it very thick and other women it's very pliable. And everyone's different and it can take some time and there's no rush and it doesn't have to break.
Right.
It can just
Right.
stretch over time. So there's a lot of myths there about anatomy and things like that. There are myths about sex that, a lot of women don't really know about orgasm and they think that orgasm only happens during intercourse, and that's not the case either. That
Nope.
can happen, of course, but there are also other ways for women to orgasm. So there's a lot of lack of information, sometimes misinformation, and hopefully we're becoming more and more empowering to college teachers and to others. I think it's also college teachers shouldn't be the very first people talking about sex. I mean, you should know something about it along with
Oy.
from reliable sources and not
Right.
from sources that
Right.
unfortunately many young frum people end up going to because they can't get access to
Right.
reliable values-based information. And that's
Yeah.
where we really need to work on being able to talk about things to girls. They call them girls and young women in high school, in seminaries, to really talk about these things
Right.
before they
Right.
have to learn them. And some of them are shocked to hear about it.
Right. And I think that this is also where there's that like push and pull against the cultural norm of like, what is our level of what level of exposure are our young women and our young men having that in many ways this older generation, and I mean older by just meaning their parents, are in denial about what our kids are actually being exposed to and where do I want this information to come from. And I think that, it takes courage as a parent to say, I'm going to be the one who's going to have the information. I want my child to come to me, and therefore I'm going to talk directly to my child. It's scary for many of us who were raised without that language. It's scary to have that conversation. And yet, when I think about the alternative, which is, I remember the conversation where I learned about sex was in third grade on a playground, and I remember the horror of my mother, going like she was so angry that somebody told me this information. But I also think about like I don't want my kids to learn it on the playground. I want them to learn it from me.
You should tell your father that that's how come you end up becoming a sex therapist.
Exactly.
I want to plug this book.
Please do.
I Am for My Beloved, A Guide to Enhanced Intimacy for Married Couples. It's not a very long book. It's a basic kind of marriage manual,
It's
pretty
excellent.
explicit, and it's for married couples throughout the life cycle. We
Yeah,
have in there chapters about all sorts of situations
it's
that
excellent.
come up, and
Yeah.
I love the opportunity. You can get it on Amazon.
Amazing, amazing. I will plug all of those things into bios. I want to thank you so much, Talli, for being with me today. There's many more topics we can talk about. It really was special. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. Take care.